The morning rush at Danny's Diner was in full swing when he walked in. Thomas Mitchell, 78 years old, moved slowly but with purpose toward an empty booth in the corner. His weathered hands gripped a worn wooden cane, and his faded jacket bore the subtle pins of someone who had served his country decades ago. All he wanted was a cup of coffee and a quiet breakfast before his doctor's appointment across the street. But when the waitress saw him settling into the booth, her expression immediately changed. Sarah Jenkins, barely 22 and new to the job, had already formed her opinion. Another homeless person trying to lounge around all day, she thought, eyeing his simple clothes and the small American flag pin on his collar that she assumed was fake. "Excuse me," she said sharply, approaching his table with crossed arms. "This is a restaurant, not a shelter. You need to order something expensive or leave." Thomas looked up calmly. "I'd like coffee and the breakfast special, please." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Do you even have money? Because I'm not covering another walkout on my shift." The old man reached into his pocket and placed a $20 bill on the table. "Will this cover it?" She snatched the bill, examined it as if checking for counterfeits, then shrugged. "Fine, but you eat and leave. Don't make this place look bad." Thomas nodded quietly. He was used to being overlooked, dismissed. It came with age and a generation that didn't demand recognition for their service. He simply wanted his coffee and to remember Maria, his late wife, who used to bring him to diners like this one during their Sunday drives. When Sarah returned with his coffee, she practically slammed the cup down, spilling some on the table. "Food's coming," she muttered. "And there's a 2-hour limit on tables." An elderly woman at the next booth, Dorothy Hayes, watched the interaction with growing concern. She recognized something in Thomas that the waitress had missed entirely. The way he held himself, the careful placement of his hands, the quiet dignity despite the disrespect. She had seen it before in her late husband, a Navy veteran. "Young lady," Dorothy called out to Sarah, "you might want to reconsider how you're treating that gentleman." Sarah turned with an annoyed expression. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. We can't have people taking up space all day." "That's not just any person," Dorothy said firmly. "Look at his pins. Look at how he carries himself." But Sarah had already walked away, muttering about interfering customers. She was too focused on her phone, texting complaints about difficult customers to her boyfriend, to notice the small crowd gathering outside the diner's front window. Thomas sat quietly, sipping his coffee and watching the morning light filter through the glass. He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, an invitation to speak at the local high school about veterans' experiences. He had planned to decline. Public speaking had never been his strength, even during his years as a decorated helicopter pilot in Vietnam. His breakfast arrived with the same dismissive attitude. Sarah barely looked at him as she set down the plate. "Anything else?" she asked impatiently. "Just the check when you have time," Thomas replied politely. "I'll bring it with your food. Speed this up," she said, walking away. That's when Dorothy decided she'd seen enough. She quietly stood up, walked to the counter, and asked to speak with the manager. But the manager was at the bank, and the assistant manager was a friend of Sarah's who dismissed the complaint with a wave. So Dorothy did what any decent person would do. She stepped outside and made a phone call to someone she knew would care. Her nephew, Colonel James Hayes, worked at the nearby VA hospital. When she explained what was happening, his response was immediate. "Aunt Dorothy, what did you say the man's name was?" "Thomas Mitchell. He's got Vietnam pins and—" "Stay right there. Do not let him leave. I'm coming now." Dorothy didn't understand the urgency in her nephew's voice, but she trusted it. She went back inside and chose a table where she could keep an eye on Thomas, who was now slowly eating his breakfast, while Sarah continued to hover impatiently nearby. "Your 2 hours start when you sat down," Sarah announced loudly enough for other customers to hear. "Just so we're clear." Thomas looked up with tired eyes but said nothing. He had faced down enemy fire, survived crashes, carried wounded soldiers to safety. A rude waitress was hardly worth a confrontation. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "My manager needs to see who's been camping out in here," she said. "Gonna post this online too, when homeless people think they own the place." That's when Dorothy stood up. "Young woman, you need to stop this right now." Mind your own business, Grandma, Sarah snapped back. The diner had gone quiet. Other customers were watching now, some recording with their phones. Thomas simply continued eating, though his hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of being treated as less than human. Then the door chimed, and Colonel James Hayes walked in, wearing his dress uniform. Behind him was Dr. Patricia Williams, the VA hospital director, and Captain Rodriguez from the local Air Force base. The conversation in the diner stopped completely. James scanned the room quickly until his eyes found Thomas. Then, in full view of everyone, he walked directly to the booth and came to attention. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "Sir, it's an honor." Thomas looked up, confusion crossing his face. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" James smiled. "No, sir, but I know who you are. Everyone in military aviation knows who you are." Sarah, still holding her phone, looked back and forth between the uniformed officers and the old man she'd been harassing. The color was draining from her face. Dr. Williams stepped forward. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Dr. Williams from the VA hospital. We've been trying to reach you about the Medal of Honor ceremony next month." "Medal of Honor?" Sarah whispered, loud enough to be heard. James turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of Colonel Thomas Mitchell, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Silver Star. He flew over 200 combat missions in Vietnam and personally saved the lives of 47 soldiers." The diner was completely silent now. Sarah's phone had slipped from her hands. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "That was a long time ago. I just came for coffee." "Sir," Captain Rodriguez added, "your last mission report is still classified, but I can tell you that your actions changed the course of an entire operation. You're a legend in the Air Force." Sarah finally found her voice, barely a whisper. I didn't know." James looked at her directly. "What exactly didn't you know? That elderly people deserve respect, that veterans exist, that maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't judge someone by their appearance." The manager, Tony DeMarco, chose that moment to return from the bank. He walked into a scene that would change his business forever. 3 military officers in dress uniforms standing around one of his customers while his waitress looked like she was about to faint. "What's going on here?" Tony asked. Dr. Williams turned to him. "Your employee has been harassing Colonel Mitchell for the past hour, taking pictures, setting time limits, treating him like he doesn't belong here." Tony's face went white. He looked at Sarah, then at Thomas, then at the uniformed officers. "Sarah, is this true?" Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded. "I'm so sorry," Tony said, approaching Thomas's table. "Sir, your meal is free, of course, and anything else you need." Thomas waved him off gently. "Not necessary. I just wanted some coffee and quiet." "It is necessary," James said firmly. "Colonel, you've given more to this country than most people could imagine. The least we can do is make sure you're treated with the respect you've earned." Thomas looked around the room at all the faces staring at him. "I appreciate that, but I didn't serve for special treatment. I served because it was right." That simple statement hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present. Here was a man who had risked everything, saved dozens of lives, earned the highest honors his country could give, and he wanted nothing more than to drink his coffee in peace. Dorothy, tears in her eyes, approached the table. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Dorothy Hayes. I called my nephew because I could see you were a good man being treated badly. I'm sorry it took so long." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown since entering the diner. "Thank you, ma'am. That was very kind." Sarah finally approached the table, her hands shaking. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was completely wrong." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "We all make mistakes, miss. The important thing is what we learn from them." The kindness in his voice, after everything she'd put him through, broke something in Sarah. She started crying right there in the middle of the diner. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said through tears. "Maybe not," Thomas said gently, "but you have it anyway. That's what we do for each other." James pulled out a chair and sat down across from Thomas. "Sir, I have to ask, will you reconsider speaking at the ceremony next month? There are young service members who need to hear your story." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking around the diner at all the faces. "You know, I was going to say no. I don't like attention. But, Dr. Williams prompted, but maybe there's still some good I can do. He looked at Sarah, who was wiping her eyes with a napkin. Maybe we all need reminders sometimes about how to treat each other. Tony stepped forward. Colonel Mitchell, I want to make this right. Would you consider letting us host a veterans breakfast here once a month? Free of charge, of course. Thomas considered this, only if it's open to all veterans, and only if Sarah here helps organize it. Everyone looked at Sarah, who was still trying to compose herself. Me? She asked. Yes, you. You made a mistake, but you're young. You can learn, and maybe helping other veterans will teach you something about service. Sarah nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I'd be honored. Captain Rodriguez checked his watch. Colonel, we should let you finish your breakfast, but before we go, there's something you should know. What's that? The high school you were supposed to speak at? They've been waiting 3 months for your answer. The principal is a former Marine. When he heard you might decline, he said, if Colonel Mitchell won't come to us, we'll bring the whole school to him. Thomas laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to lighten the entire room. Is that a threat, Captain? More like a promise, sir. As the officers prepared to leave, James pulled out a business card. Colonel, my direct number. Anything you need, anytime. Thomas pocketed the card. Thank you, all of you. After they left, the diner slowly returned to normal conversation, but the atmosphere had changed. Other customers approached Thomas, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service. He accepted each gesture graciously, but without fanfare. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. Colonel Mitchell, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you forgive someone so easily, after what I did? Thomas thought for a moment. In Vietnam, I made plenty of mistakes. Good people died because of some of them. If I couldn't forgive others, how could I ever forgive myself? 3 weeks later, Danny's Diner held its first veterans breakfast. 57 veterans attended, from World War II to Afghanistan. Sarah had spent every free hour learning about military history, reaching out to local veteran organizations, and preparing for the event. Thomas arrived early, wearing a clean shirt and his old service pins. Sarah greeted him at the door with a smile that held none of the judgment from that first morning. Good morning, Colonel Mitchell, your usual table. That would be perfect, Sarah. Thank you. The local newspaper covered the event, but the story wasn't about the breakfast. It was about second chances, about the power of respect, and about an old veteran who taught a young waitress that service comes in many forms. The headline read, Local Diner Hosts Veterans, Learns About Service. Sarah kept that newspaper clipping on her bulletin board at home, next to a photo from Thomas's Medal of Honor ceremony. She had been invited, along with Tony and several regular customers. In the photo, Thomas stood with military officials and government dignitaries, but his eyes were on the small section where Sarah sat with Dorothy Hayes, both of them beaming with pride. 6 months later, Sarah enrolled in nursing school, inspired by stories she'd heard at the monthly veterans breakfasts. She wanted to work at the VA hospital, to continue serving those who had served. Thomas never did give that speech at the high school. Instead, he started visiting classrooms with Sarah, telling stories not just about war, but about coming home, about building a life after service, about the importance of treating every person with dignity. The last story he told was always the same. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with respect, with kindness, with the decision to see the person in front of you as a human being worthy of dignity. That's a battle we can all fight, and it's one we can all win. Danny's Diner still operates today. The corner booth where Thomas Mitchell sat that morning has a small plaque, reserved for those who serve. But every employee knows the real story. It's not reserved for veterans, though they're always welcome. It's reserved for anyone who needs a reminder that service comes in many forms, and that respect is something we owe each other, simply by virtue of being human. Thomas Mitchell passed away peacefully 2 years later. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, from military officials to diner regulars to high school students he'd spoken with. Sarah gave one of the eulogies, sharing the story of how a patient old veteran taught her that everyone deserves dignity, and how that lesson changed her life. The monthly Veterans Breakfast continues, now run entirely by volunteers. And every month at exactly 9 a.m., someone places a cup of black coffee at the corner booth, not as a memorial, but as a reminder. A reminder that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It continues every time you choose kindness over judgment, respect over dismissal, understanding over assumptions. The story lives on, not in newspaper headlines or social media posts, but in the way people treat each other. In young servers who take an extra moment to smile at elderly customers. In veterans who share their stories to help others heal. In communities that understand that everyone has something to offer and everyone deserves to be seen. Because sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't guns or bombs, but simple human decency. And sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the best in each other. Thomas Mitchell never asked to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted his coffee and a moment of peace. But in receiving that simple respect, he taught everyone around him what service really means. Not the grand gestures or the medals, but the daily choice to treat others with the dignity that makes us all human. The corner booth at Danny's Diner remains a testament to that lesson. And every morning, when the first customers arrive and see that small plaque, they're reminded that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just carry themselves with quiet dignity and treat everyone they meet as if they matter. Because in the end, that's what Thomas Mitchell taught them all. Everyone matters, everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect. It's a simple lesson, but one that can change the world, one interaction at a time.